and gentlemen, boys and girls, the Philadelphia Eagles are going to take a defensive lineman in round 1 of the 2025 NFL Draft. I could say that with conviction, and I could say that with a little bit of chutzpah. Yes, I used chutzpah. I know you look at me on the YouTube channel and you see my face and you're like, this guy knows chutzpah? Yeah, and guess what? I even have the phlegm, the actual pronunciation correctly. Yes, I use chutzpah. I can say the Philadelphia Eagles are going to take a defensive lineman with such chutzpah. It's because it's all about the money. That's what this offseason has been about. And it's not about money for this year. It's about money for the next 2, 3, 4 years. Remember, this organization has to pay Jalen Carter, Nolan Smith, J-Legs Hunt, Cooper DeJean, Quinyon Mitchell, Reed Blankenship, Sidney Brown, Jordan Davis, and I'm sure they are not going to be able to pay all of those guys. But in order to have as good of a shot to pay all those guys, they need to hit on their draft picks, and it has to be valuable draft picks. And when I mean valuable, I don't mean necessarily just getting and hitting on your first round pick. I mean getting a good player at way below market value, even when the 5th-year option comes up. And that's why I believe you're not going to see them take a defensive back in the first round anymore. It's why I don't believe they're going to take linebacker in the first round, or wide receiver, or running back. They're going offensive lineman or defensive lineman. And quite frankly, I think their needs are more on the defensive lineman side. Think of it this way. If you got a good player, a good defensive lineman, how much would he warrant on the open market? Milton Williams was excellent in Philadelphia, but he's a good player in the NFL. Like a good player. He got $26 million from the Patriots. Josh Sweat, damn good player. He got $18 to $19 million from the Cardinals. Jonathan Allen, who I was advocating for Philadelphia to go out and sign, he got a lot of money in the open market. Bryce Huff last season got a lot of money. 3 years, $51 million, and he didn't do shit because he was considered a good player. My point being is, if you take a defensive lineman with your first round pick and over the course of the first 4 years and get a 5th-year option out of them, let's just assume that it's a round number. I don't know the exact figure for a 5th-year option, but let's assume at pick 32, a 5th-year option is worth $10 to $12 million. And if you have a good defensive lineman at that value, you have an absolute bargain, an absolute steal with that pick. And it's also good to use for future contract negotiation because that's what Howie Roseman and this organization has done. They did it with Jalen Hurts. They did it with Devontae Smith. They did it with Landon Dickerson. They did it with a lot of players on this team. Using the 5th-year option as an extension purpose for longer contract details and making that part of, securing a lesser cap hit. Again, they're wizards at manipulating the cap and kicking the can down the road, I understand. But as the cap goes up every single offseason, and the more and more you could save money on your draft picks and getting good, valuable assets there, it makes your team much more pliable to get good players, and that's what Philadelphia has done. And that's why they're going to get a defensive lineman in the first round. And the two of them that we're going to talk about today is Walter Nolen and James Pearce. Those are the two guys that Philadelphia could potentially get. And we've talked about other linemen in the past, like Nick Scourin and Jack Sawyer in previous episodes. But today, on this episode of the Riding the Bench Eagles podcast, we're talking about Walter Nolen and James Pearce. Okay? And before we get into all that, let me introduce myself. I'm Asif Badi. I already mentioned this is the Riding the Bench Eagles podcast. And I am a Birds fan who talks about the Birds, only the Birds, and nothing but the Philadelphia Eagles. So please do us a favor here at this channel. Help us grow organically by shooting this video a thumbs up, commenting your thoughts in the comment section below, and subscribing to the channel. It helps me get out to as many Eagle fans out there as much as possible on the World Wide Web. Also, check us out on audio platforms such as Apple Podcasts and Spotify, and leave us a 5-star review, because in the end, ladies and gentlemen, entertainment for your listening pleasure should be free. And subscribing doesn't cost you a damn thing. And free shit in this economy is well worth it. So do us a favor, support the channel. We thank you for your support. Walter Nolen and James Pearce are the guys that I believe Philadelphia is going to be able to have a chance to get. Now, I know you're thinking, James Pearce, how could we possibly get him? He seems to be one of the higher ranking pass rushers in this NFL draft. And you're correct. I'll kind of give you my reasons why a little bit later in the episode. We're going to talk about Walter Nolen, but before I do that, I wanted to talk about something in regards to understanding gaps in Vic Fangio's scheme, okay? We know he runs a cover 2 high shell. That basically means these safeties drive back and line up like 15 yards off the line of scrimmage, 15 to 25 yards off the line of scrimmage, and then when the play snap begins, they drop back even further so that you avoid the big play. And while it's a very basic look pre-snap, Vic Fangio's brilliance, he does a lot of movement post-snap, trying to confuse the quarterback, making the quarterback hold the ball a little bit longer, throwing off the timing of plays, and that's how this defense ends up getting either turnovers, sacks, 3-and-outs, all that stuff. It relies on having the quarterback make a mistake or a player on the field make a mistake, whether it's spacing, timing, incomplete passes, however it may be. It trades yardage for points. It trades, big plays for 14, 15, 16 play drives, and it plays the odds of probability. The more plays you get on a drive, the likelihood is that you can make a mistake is going higher. If you have a 3 to 4 play drive that ends up in points, that's a bad look for a Fangio defense. He wants you to have to work 13, 14, 15, 16 play drives. You have to earn it. And that's how he operates his scheme. And I say all that because now, when we're talking about a player like Walter Nolen here, one of the things that makes him such a unique prospect outside of the physical intangibles that he has, look, he's 6'4", 296 pounds. He ran a 4.9, 540. It's impressive stuff. Super athlete. But what makes him unique is his ability to play all along the defensive line. He could play the 0, he could play the 1, the 2, the 3, the 4, and he could play the 5. And now when I refer to these numbers, I had to look it up myself here, so please, because I'm not a football, aficionado by any means, but some terminology we have to understand. Each number that we spoke about that he could play, the 0, the 1, the 2, the 3, the 4, the 5, those are techniques that defensive linemen in the NFL have to be able to play up. If I yell an even number, for example, so if I say, oh, this guy's really good at the 2, this guy's really good at that 4, he could play the 0. It means he's playing directly in front of a particular position on the offensive line. So if I say this guy, like Jordan Davis, for example, they asked him a lot to play 0 and a little bit of that 1 or 2 gap scheme. Okay? Playing the 0 means you're lining up directly in front of the center on the offensive line, and you're going bull rushing on him. If you're playing as a 2, you're lining directly up against the guard. And this means on both sides here. So you got 0 down the middle playing against the center. You got the 2 playing against the guards. And then your 4, you're playing head up against the tackles on the edges. And then you also have your 6, which is playing up against the tight end. That's your even number. You're playing straight up against somebody, mano y mano. When you throw an odd number at somebody, oh, he could play the 3. He could play the 1. He's really good at the 5. Kind of like Milton Williams was. That means you're playing in between those positions. Okay. So 0 is directly in front of the center. The 1 gap, you're playing on either side of the center, whether it's the left or the right side. If you're playing the 3, you're playing in between the guard and the tackle on each side. Makes sense. If you're playing the 5, for example, you're playing on the outside of the tackles, and then you got your 7 hole, your 7 gap, your 7 technique, which is outside the tight end, and then you got your wide 9s, which is really far outside, really coming off the edges. That's like that Juan Castillo offense when Andy Reid was here. That's the Jason Babin years, right? That wide 9 stance, pure pass rushing. Really bad against the run, pure pass rushing. Okay? So that's what those numbers correlate to. And then you have like, you know, your 4 inside shade or your 3, like your 2 inside shade, things like that. And that just means you're kind of playing just off that particular. So if I play a 2-eye, for example, I'm lining up in front of the guard, but I'm picking a shoulder to go up against, like his inside shoulder. So it's almost like I'm playing a 1 gap technique, but I'm really not. I'm still bull rushing the guard. Okay. Again, all of that is to be said because Vic Fangio, the way he wants his defensive linemen to play is to be able to have multiple gaps in control while playing in 1 gap. I know that sounds weird. So a lot of the things that he would do with Milton Williams, for example, he would have him play that 3 technique. So he'd always be playing between a guard and a tackle. So he would have to hold down that gap, but still be able to cover the 2 technique and the 1 technique. And then Jalen Carter would have to do the same thing, and then they would go down the line like that. So that's part of the reason why sometimes you'll hear this Vic Fangio scheme is either a 2-gap scheme or a 1.5 gap scheme. It means you have to be able to control your own lane and still be able to cover the ass of the other lane that's right next to you. And what made Milton Williams so good in Philadelphia was that he was really good at controlling his gap and playing off another. That 2-gap, 1.5 gap scheme that they run in Philadelphia, it's unique. And it's not an easy thing to play. It's why Jordan Davis struggled with it for such a long time. Only this year did he start to get a little bit more of a feel because then they asked him to play the 1. They asked him to play the 0. They asked him just to play the 2. And he was able to just kind of focus and bull rush on 1 defender, on 1 offensive tackle or guard, I should say. Again, I say all that because Walter Nolen is the prospect we're talking about here. And one of the best things about this player, not only is his physical gifts, but its ability to play the 0 technique, the 1, the 2, the 3, the 4. He could play all along the defensive line. That's what makes this player unique. And especially because he may be there at 32, Philadelphia may just have to sit back and say, hey, are we going to get too cute here and just not take Walter Nolen? I mean, the guy's got really, really good explosive athleticism for his size. He has really good get off at the ball when this ball is snapped. And like I said, his versatility, it's as good as it can come for a player who plays nose tackle at Ole Miss. The other thing that he has really good, based on his, really good skill set based on his tape is his ability to collapse the pocket when he does play the 0 or the 1. If he can control that gap and he gets a good bull rush on you, he's really, really strong at driving his feet and collapsing the pocket, giving no quarterback room to step up. And when you have Jalen Carter and Walter Nolen ends up being a Philadelphia Eagle and being able to collapse the pocket moving forward, and then on the edges you have Nolan Smith, Jalen Hunt, maybe Moro Ajomo playing in that 3-gap technique, all of a sudden quarterbacks are going to have a really hard time getting the ball off. Because now you got 2 defensive tackles pressing up against you, and then you got your edge rushers who are really athletic, really explosive, and can close gaps quickly. So Walter Nolen would be a really fine pick here. The only hesitation that you probably would have with a guy like Walter Nolen is that at times he has a little bit of a conditioning issue. He can get really tired really easily and play high. This is the same thing with Jordan Davis. Jordan Davis at times, when he gets fatigued, he ends up playing really high with his pads, and then he can end up being driven back. Same thing with Walter Nolen, because he's such a physical freak. If he's not being able to beat you on first, second down at times, third down he can have a little bit of a struggle because he can play really, really high when he's fatigued and get driven back. But again, that's something that can be coached out of him. That could be fatigue. That could be technique. Like, all those things can be coached out of him, which is a positive, right? If it was something like motor, if it's something like drive and will, that's something that you can't necessarily coach up. You either have that or you don't. But technique, skill set, the ability to just maintain focus, those things can be coached up, okay? The other thing that he has, even though he has the versatility of playing any gap, he does have a little trouble with gap discipline. But again, that's something that can be coached up. That's not a detriment to the player, okay? It's just something that, hey, Vic Fangio is not going to like a player who's not going to stay in their gap and control their gaps, okay? You need to be disciplined in his defense. It's why Chauncey Gardner-Johnson is not a Philadelphia Eagle anymore. As much of a playmaker as the player was, he would always do a little bit of freelancing. He would always kind of do his own thing, not play the zone right. It's important to be able to just know where players are on the field, trusting your zone so that everyone else is lined up properly. It's why Walter Nolen, while he may be a really interesting pick, it's just something that's going to have to be kept an eye on because he does have a little bit of an issue in gap discipline. And that's just his youth. That's his raw ability. And again, it's not like we're looking for him to come and be the next Fletcher Cox. It'd be excellent, but he ain't gonna be Fletcher Cox. Okay, he just needs to be a solid player who could be a rotational piece and supplement the excellence of Jalen Carter and the excellence of other players on this defense. Walter Nolen's a really, really interesting prospect. And again, I see why a lot of Eagle fans love this guy and would love to have him in Philadelphia. However, the more intriguing prospect or the more intriguing suggestion to me, and excuse me as I take a sip of tea here. Jeez, that's always good stuff, man. James Pearce. Now, I know he's ranked as one of the higher pass rushers in the NFL draft, and Philadelphia is at pick 32. To me, I think Howie Roseman, while I'm not going to sit here and say that Philadelphia loves their splash moves. I know they have the reputation of splash moves, and they do like to make statements with their acquisitions. It is not out of the realm of comprehension for Howie Roseman to go ahead and make a move to trade up into the draft to get a quality player like a James Pearce. James Pearce out of Tennessee is 6'5", 245 pounds, and ran a 4.47 40. Probably the most polished pass rusher in the draft outside of Abdul Carter. We know he's top 5. He ain't going to be on the board. Again, super smooth. One of the more better pass rushers in the draft in terms of skill set, technique, moves to attack the offensive guard or tackle. And he has the ability to not only put his hand in the dirt with a 3-point stance, but he can come off the edge with 2 feet on the ground, no hand in the dirt, and just get after you with his pinning the ears back and going after the quarterback. Right? Some of the things that he's really good at is his get off. His get off is excellent. If you watch film on James Pearce, you can watch the second the ball snap. He times it so well, and he gets good leverage once he gets a good push off the line. The other thing, like I said, he's a polished pass rusher. So he has all the moves. He's got a really nice, he's got really good bend. And the other thing that he does really well is get physical. He can rip through offensive lineman hands. The rip move where he engages and he kind of cuts off basically the arms of the offensive tackle and guard and gets around the guy. The other thing he is disciplined, which is probably one of the most important factors in what will make James Pearce a good NFL player. If you could stay disciplined and play gaps super well, and you do exactly what the assignment of the defensive play call is doing, you're going to have a long life in this league. Because coaches want players who, look, they don't need you to be Superman. You're in the NFL. You're already good enough to make an impact. What you need to be is disciplined and consistent. That's the key. If you could do those things, you'll have a long life in the NFL. And I know you're looking at me as if I understand the nuances of the NFL. No. What it is, though, is the nuance to any job. Being able to follow directions, being able to stay consistent, and just continuing your growth, it's sustainable long-term in any field. So it's sustainable in football. Again, really disciplined, smooth pass rusher, knows how to get home to the quarterback, because when he gets around the edge, if he gets good bend and he gets past that tackle, it becomes a quarterback sack. His closing speed's really good, and he can really bring down the quarterback. And the other thing is, man, his numbers are just productive. Like, there are other defensive linemen in this draft who have more physical gifts probably than him, but they don't have the numbers to back up what his production was in Tennessee. He was excellent. Really, really was. Again, I like James Pearce because he's a disciplined player. I love the fact that he has good size. Pause. And resume. And the fact that he's 6'5", 245, runs a 4.47, it's a good athlete right there too. The only problem with the guy, and again, I say this because, you know, you have to have some sort of faults when you're looking at players here. James Pearce is a guy who's not necessarily the best against the run, which is also an important factor when you're playing the 5 technique or when you're playing the 7 technique in a Vic Fangio scheme. You got to be able to hold your gap and be able to play the run. That's something that Josh Sweat was really good at last season. And it's why, while I get Josh Sweat wasn't a superstar for us, he was damn good. Like, he was damn good at the edge. He set the edge. You couldn't run on him. And he was a good enough pass rusher to make pressures on the quarterback. Same thing with James Pearce here. He needs to learn how to play gap control with the run game. Because if you run a power run scheme at James Pearce, he can get lost in the play. And when you're playing against teams like San Francisco, like Buffalo, like Green Bay, like Washington, like the Rams in the NFC, you're going to be going up against some power running games. And you got to be able to stop the run. Now, I know Jordan Davis is there, but you know what, James Pearce? If you're an edge player, James Pearce or whomever gets drafted in Philadelphia, if you play edge, we don't need you to be a 10-plus sack guy. I know that's the sexy thing we want to see out of a lot of players, but what made Bryce Huff, for example, such an anemic player for us was the fact you couldn't put him against the run. He couldn't slow down a freaking parked car in the run game. That's why they inserted Brandon Graham, and say what you want about him. While he was never the greatest defensive end in the National Football League, he was always ranked top 20 throughout his whole career against the run and the pass. He was a fine ball player, one of the best Philadelphia Eagles of all time. And it's because of his ability to not only create pressures, but to play the run. And you don't need big numbers to be a productive defensive end in the National Football League. You got to be able to be versatile and play the run. And that's a big knock on James Pearce. Not the best against power run schemes. Can get lost in the play at times. And the other thing that he can do, especially if he's having a really nice day, he can get home. Yes, he's an excellent quarterback sacks guy. Sometimes he gets upfield too quickly and gives the quarterback a lane to be able to escape through. Right? Which again, when you're playing against Jaden Daniels in our division, when you're playing up against a lot of quarterbacks who could scramble in the NFC, and when you have to eventually go up against guys like Mahomes, like Allen, Lamar, right? You want to be able to play good gap discipline and not go up the field too quickly where they slip out and make a big play. So again, not something that's detrimental. It's just something you have to coach out of him, which I believe Clint Hurt and Vic Fangio can do going forward. And the other thing that he has is, like I said, shedding blocks in the run game. It's not an easy thing in the NFL. If you're not able to play the run in college, it's really tough to play the run in the NFL. But again, how much of that is desire and how much of that is technique and coaching? If it's the latter, taking a player like James Pearce, trading up in the draft to get a player like James Pearce is a quality move. And mind you, Howie Roseman doesn't need to accumulate so many draft picks and get 7, 8, 9, 10 guys to fill out the roster here. You only need a handful of guys because most of your roster is intact. You just need to round out some of the edges, fill in some of the depth. Trading up, using some of the assets rather in the second, third, and fourth round of this draft to move up a few spots in the first to get a quality player that you know will make an impact for you, not only on the field, but down the line on the books. To me, it's a no-brainer. I would do it. My gut feeling is that Howie Roseman will try to trade up in the draft to get a quality defensive end, get a quality pass rusher, and at worst case scenario, maybe he goes offensive lineman, but I highly doubt it. I think he goes defensive lineman here, tries to get value for the pick for the next 5 years, so that way he can pay Jalen Carter, Nolan Smith, Jordan Davis, etc. So that's my little synopsis on these two players. Sorry about the long-winded episode, ladies and gentlemen, but when we get into draft season, it becomes a little tougher not to go in depth with some of these players and some of their skill sets here. So again, Walter Nolen and James Pearce are guys that Philadelphia would love to have here. I think Howie Roseman is going to trade up in the draft and get players like a James Pearce or maybe somebody else like a Shamar Stewart. But regardless whoever Philadelphia decides to pick, one thing is for sure, guys. Howie's vision is 2020. We have to sit back, relax, and let him run the show. Because in the end, once the offseason's over and the dust settles, we're going to be calling this a masterclass once again. And considering the amount of contracts that he's going to have to sign down the road, no one's going to have any argument to refute against it.
Hey, thank you so much for watching the Riding the Bench Eagles podcast. If you want to continue to support the channel, please hit the like and subscribe button down below. Also, check us out on Instagram and TikTok at Riding the Bench Eagles Pod. We're also on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, you name it, we're on there. Thank you so much for listening, and please join us next time here at the Riding the Bench Eagles Podcast.